and intuitively, it seems counterproductive for an agency responsible for national security to promote any sort of globalization and waning of national sovereignty. Like, can't this only weaken our own intelligence if we sort of, I don't know, just give away our power and let it be, subject to a committee, an international committee?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you would think, but my view is that really entities like the OSS and the CIA were set up always with the intent of being essentially operatives for international global elite interests. And the reason I say that is that if you get into the people who helped to set up the OSS, like Bill Donovan, or excuse me, with Bill Donovan, they came from British intelligence to over here to do that, and from Canadian intelligence. So William Stevenson, who was Canadian intelligence, came, as well as did Ian Fleming, as well as did Noel Coward, as well as did a bunch of, they call it irregulars. And so if you watched, as you mentioned, Good Shepherd with Matt Damon, that's actually showing you that, because I'm trying to remember, is it Stephen Fry? I forget who plays or maybe somebody, it's another British actor that plays his handler, because he goes to learn trade.
Well, there's Alec Baldwin's kind of his handler, but he's also got that college professor.
It's when he goes to England, I'm saying, right? So he gets a British professor who's kind of his British intelligence handler, who's the the gay guy that propositions him and all that. And he's the one that teaches him tradecraft. Now, I think that's supposed to express that the U.S. OSS apparatus was set up essentially by these UK British intelligence operatives. And that was actually done by design, if you get into the history of British intelligence, because the Milner Society, Lord Milner, who had a huge amount of influence on the British intelligence apparatus from the time of 1900 all the way up until even into the 20s and 30s. Milner, along with Cecil Rhodes, wanted to bring the U.S. back under the aegis of the Anglo-American establishment, and they wanted the America to be an engine for global interests, because the British establishment had already, even in the 1890s, I've now found older versions of global New World Orderism before even the 1920s and 30s. You can go back to the 1890s when this is dreamt up with what's called the Milner Circle. And that's where we get a lot of these steering committees, like the Trilateral Commission, the CFR. They're modeled on the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which was an old Fabian institution, which had the idea of creating and promoting Fabian socialism as the ultimate model for world government. So the tweak there is that it's not identical to classical Marxism, because the Fabians had the idea that Marxism would be a lot more successful if it allied itself with monopoly capital. And that's exactly that's the thesis, by the way, of Quigley and Tragedy and Hope, and in Anglo-American establishment. That's how we got to World War II, with the OSS basically being created under the auspices of wartime intelligence, but it becomes this private, secret, deep state that, in the analysis of two famous geopolitical writers who I think are correct, Servando Gonzalez in his book Psychological Warfare in the New World Order, and F. William Engdahl in his book Full Spectrum Dominance, they basically posit that the CIA is the private army of the Rockefellers. And so I think that that's the best way to understand it. There was always really for these people. It was never really about the national interest. And you can even go back further, prior to OSS and CIA, to in the time of Woodrow Wilson. The intelligence apparatus at that time was called the Inquiry. And the Inquiry was a bunch of academics working under Wilson to push, even at that time, the Federal Reserve. And we all know about, if you know about G. Edward Griffin, right? Colonel Edwin Mandel House and Woodrow Wilson, and how the Federal Reserve Act got pushed. That was all the same people that I'm talking about behind this sort of, Fabian empire that they want to construct. This Federal Reserve model is their model. This is what they wanted.
That's what I wanted to ask you about next, was how this, because you mentioned 1890s. That's, in the scheme of things, right before the establishment of the Federal Reserve. I mean,
exactly.
Feasibly linked. And so I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on how the Federal Reserve plays into this, because at first it looks like a national centralized, fractional reserve banking system. But as we've seen play out over the last century, more than a century now, it seems that it's intimately connected with globalist interests in terms of what we do impacts every other currency. We're the formal, reserve currency, and we were on the gold standard, and then we weren't. people think Nixon brought us off the gold standard, but maybe it was really FDR, like who knows what. And so it's so complicated, but it seems like not a coincidence that, within a handful of years of establishing the Federal Reserve, we have World War One, and then within a decade or so, we have the Great Depression, and then we have World War Two again, and then we have this, this Keynesian conference in the 50s or whatever, right, to establish the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, and then with a handful. And then it's Nixon after that, taking us off the gold standard. And then it's hyperinflation after that. And then it's the Cold War after that. And it's like every problem that we've had globally the last 100 years seems to be inevitably linked to the fact that we have a fucking Federal Reserve, right? And I don't know if I'm just like a dumbass, but like, what are your thoughts in terms of that?
It is. I mean, so in Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, he posits that the locus of this system goes back to the gold notes, the promissory gold notes model, where they could basically just create as many gold notes as they wanted to inflate the currency, while this was all used to basically buy up everything. And the central banking elite have the actual assets. They have the actual gold and silver or assets, land, whatever. Meanwhile, they're inflating the currency with gold notes. And then he says that the central bank model that was utilized by throughout Europe, and then eventually spread to other countries like the U.S. as you're talking. I mean, that is a Fabian style. It's a quasi-Marxist, because if you remember in Marx's Communist Manifesto, he talks about a central bank model, right? But the difference is that it's not owned publicly by the people as it's portrayed to be. It's a private central bank, as you know. But here's the key point. Quigley says that the central bank of central banks is the Bank for International Settlements. And it was set up to be the central bank for all of the world's central banks, including the American Federal Reserve. So once the U.S. went on the Federal Reserve model in, at the turn of the century, last century, that is what allowed the power elite out of those London circles to then have the wherewithal to steer the U.S. into creating the OSS and the CIA, which is what put us in the deep state problem to begin with. So it was a direct connect. You're absolutely right. And the other thing too is that it's the same. These are the same entities funding both sides of World War I and World War II. Right? Quigley says that as well. And you mentioned Keynes. Keynes was a Fabian by self-profession, and so he was instrumental, as you said, Bretton Woods system, and that was intentional to create a global dollar-based system, but not a dollar-based system based on anything like a hard asset. So you're absolutely right to go back to FDR too, because if you read Quigley's chapter on FDR is amazing. It's one of the overlooked chapters because he talks about in that chapter that FDR was really just putting the whole country for the public works projects into debt to the banking elite. And all that did was kick the can down the road and then make the next generation in debt. So it wasn't a public works project that just went into debt and somehow paid for everything. It was a kick the can down the road, which is what we still do, right? The whole Federal Reserve System, all the quantitative easing, all of these boom busts. Basically, the boom bust cycle is a rigged game, is the point. That's the whole point.
Yeah. It's just absolutely insane how irresponsible this has ultimately been. But it's the part of the problem is our leaders know that they'll be gone before there's accountability, right? But we're coming. It seems like we're coming to a head though, where like somebody's going to be here. Like, so who do we blame when this pops? Who gets blamed?
As you know, every country that has the Federal Reserve fiat system eventually goes bankrupt.
Right.
They eventually go into this, hyperinflation. It takes 7,000 Zimbabwe dollars to buy a donut, right?
Yeah, but traditionally, when like if you look at the Weimar Republic, they had an insane hyperinflation problem, and basically with a new government, for better or for worse, they were able to just say fuck all to that problem and start a whole new currency. Like 1933, they're like, all right, no more inflation. We got these new banking system, right? And it, everything changed. And I'm not saying that was like, ethical or the right way to do it, but it does seem like when these collapses happen with a certain type of leadership, which is typically very autocratic and problematic, you can actually solve it. So like if our dollar collapses, are we talking about like decades of global collapse and famine, or are we just talking about a power vacuum that catalyzes autocracy and the problem immediately being solved within, a handful of years?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not sure how it will play out. I mean, I definitely think that there is potential economic collapse in the cards in the next 5 to 10 years. That seems to
Sure.
be something that they talk about quite often. And if you read Klaus's stuff, he kind of talks about it like, the more of the crises that we have, the better for us, because it'll be the catalyst for bringing in the next business phase of the New World Order. He's even said that publicly in talks about the next pandemic will be the cyber pandemic, and it will be like nothing before. It will be the greatest step forward to the new world order. He has these actual quotes about this kind of stuff. So probably something. He talks about cyber polygon. Maybe that's what it'll be that triggers a kind of a eco collapse. I don't know, but I mean, it does. It definitely seems like that's in the cards, and it wouldn't. It doesn't seem like it'd be that difficult, given the fact that the whole system runs on debt. It's like debt based on debt, based on debt, based on debt. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at FTX, the recent crypto exchange crash, which is all a big scam. I mean, that's kind of like the way the dollar runs, right? I mean, that's like a micro scale version of what the Federal Reserve System is, right?
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure and take use of the promo code for the show sponsor, for this channel sponsor, which is chalk.com. That's CHOQ.com. You can find the links in the description below the video. You get 50% off any of the great organic, actually better than organic supplements that they offer at chalk.com. If you want to support my channel, the best way to do that is to head on over there and use that promo code J50. That's J50 to get 50% off. You can also use the recurring subscription of J53 Life. That's J53 LIFE. If you want to sign up for automatic recurring subscriptions on those excellent supplements. Health is absolutely necessary in combating the toxic culture that we live in. I also would say if you want to get access to my books, head on over to the shop at my website and get signed copies there. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about on this Federal Reserve thread was, what are your thoughts on the origin of cryptocurrency? Do you think that this was something that was a plant by the intelligence apparatuses that exist, or do you think that this is a rogue sort of protest to the establishment monetary system?
I think that Bitcoin is the solution at an economic level to the Federal Reserve scam system.
Right.
I mean, I put a lot of time and research into this. I did change my mind on Bitcoin some years ago. About 2016, I changed my mind. I used to think it was a scam and, kind of like promoting the uh, electronic, central bank
Sure. Well, it
model
kind
and
of
all
was
that.
until it wasn't.
Well, then you notice that according to a lot of these global elite, they hate Bitcoin. Like, they can't stand it, they want it to go away, and they want you on this other thing, right? Oh, come over here to Klaus coin, come over here to Fed coin, come over here to CBDC, and all of those things. I think are ultimately versions of war on Bitcoin. So
Yes.
it's true that the origin of Bitcoin is somewhat mysterious, but I think that the originators of that did that on purpose, and they were wise to do that, because then it couldn't be pinned on any single person and an ideology, because the idea was, let's create the most ethical, the most fair, the most energy resilient form of currency that man could have. And so I think that's what Bitcoin is. There are potentially, maybe there's a couple other projects that will end up making it and that are good. I know at Rockfin we have a native currency, a token, which I support that. But typically, I tend to just favor Bitcoin.
Do you think, because this is just my intuition, so this is me just shooting shit, okay? The more time goes on, the more I think Elon Musk is at least partially Satoshi Nakamoto. Just because of his association with PayPal, and he was really an
Yeah.
innovator in the online financial transaction tech space 10 years before, and he left PayPal, and then his non-compete probably would have expired right
Mhm.
around the time that PayPal's white paper was. He's obviously got the intelligence and the skill set and the network to accomplish it. I don't necessarily believe it's one person, but I
Yeah.
find it kind of hard to believe that Musk wasn't involved.
Yeah, I was going to say I tend to favor the thesis that it was probably a group of people, and yeah, he certainly could have been one of those people. Definitely
Hmm.
possible.